everybody, to colleagues who are here, to students, to friends, whether you're here in person in the room or a number of people are joining us via Zoom. So wherever you are in the world, you're very welcome to join us today. I have to say this is the first in-person seminar that I've chaired since the start of the pandemic. And it's actually great to have a seminar in which I can see people in the flesh. So it's absolutely fantastic. So you're all very welcome to be here. And I'm also feel that it's appropriate that we're having this discussion on Britain and Brexit in the Alan Walters building. Those of you of a certain vintage will understand the symbolism of holding this event in the Alan Walters building. For those of you who don't know that, at a spare moment, Google ERM and Margaret Thatcher, and you will find out a lot about Alan Walters. But if you're joining us online, you're just as welcome. I know a number of colleagues are there online, so you're very welcome to be with us. I would just say it's the first time I've moderated a hybrid event. So if I make a faux pas anywhere along the way, I apologize in advance, but I will try and make sure that I don't make those mistakes. So I wanted to just start off by saying a couple of words of thanks. So firstly, I'd like to thank Kerry Myers, the Student Enhancement Officer in the School of Government, for her help. And I'd also like to thank Maddie Maguire and her team, Paul and Vanessa, from the COS Digital team who've set up the online aspect of this seminar today. So thank you very much indeed. We know that events don't just happen, and the people behind the scenes, we always should thank them for their efforts. So thank you very much. Before I start talk about today's events, just want to flag up a few forthcoming events that we've got. On the 17th of November, we have an online event. Natasha Lindstedt from Essex and our awesome new colleague Licia Cianetti are going to talk about democratic decay and authoritarian resurgence. On the 18th of November, for those of you as fascinated by Bulgarian elections as me, and they are very fascinating, by the way, watch them this weekend. We have a joint event with Temple University in Rome, with the University of Leiden, and part of the wider Represent network. That is also online. And on the 24th of November, we have a special seminar reflecting on COP. That's going to be in person with the terrific trio. Your timing is absolutely perfect, Julie. With Ellie Chowns, Julie Gilson, and Emma Foster, reflecting on one of the big events of 2021. All of the details of those are on the POLSIS website, and I'd encourage you to follow that, the links on that. And everyone is welcome for any event that we organize. Today's speaker, it is an honor and a real privilege and a pleasure to welcome Anand Menon. Anand is a professor of politics at King's College London. He's also the director of the UK in a Changing Europe. One or two people in this room know UK in a Changing Europe extremely well because they have been fellows or are still fellows for the UK in a Changing Europe. But for those of you, some of my students in this room, for example, who don't know it, it's the foremost place to go for insightful commentary and analysis of the process of Brexit and Britain's relationship with the European Union. So it's a fantastic resource, a number of fellows that are there, a number of fascinating, brilliant reports, and I'd encourage you to go and look at their website, and all under the directorship of the great Anand Menon. Now, Anand, I would also just emphasize, it's a particular pleasure to welcome Anand today because he was a colleague of many of ours in this room for a good decade or so. So it's a real pleasure to welcome you back to Birmingham. Again, for those of you who don't know Anand so well, just to emphasize that he's published some terrific books. He published this terrific book, Europe, the State of the Union, which he wrote whilst he was a colleague of ours here in Birmingham. I can remember those discussions. And also, my son tells me it's 80p on Amazon. So there you are, it's a bargain. And secondly, another terrific book, very appropriate given what Anand's going to be talking about today on Brexit and British politics, co-written with Geoffrey Evans of the University of Oxford. Now, today's session, we're going to try and make it as inclusive as possible and as interactive as possible. So it's not going to be one of those events where Anand would talk for a long time and then there'll be just a tiny bit of space at the end for Q&A. We're going to have plenty of time for Q&A. And equally, I know it was billed as a conversation between the two of us, but I don't want to dominate the conversation. So I will just start off with a few questions, which I hope Anand will be able to smash out of the park like Virat Kohli. And then we can come to your Q&As. And for those of you online, there should be an opportunity for you to ask questions through the Q&A function. So please use that if you would like to ask a question, and I'm very happy to ask Anand those questions. So I'd like to start off by asking you one question, and seeing one or two of my students in the room, particularly international students, they often want me to try and explain how and why did it happen. So I know you could talk about this for an hour and a half, just on that one particular question. But how would you explain why we ended up with such a hard Brexit?
Gosh, well, thanks for inviting me. That was the politest "don't drone on for too long" I've ever had from a chair, by the way. So I'll try not to. But it's a messy story. I mean, you can list the reasons why we got from where we were on the 24th of June to where we ended up with the trade operation. They include, in no particular order, and I might come back and try and put them in some kind of Theresa May's stubbornness / incompetence, you know, select as appropriate, but I think both apply. The determination of both sides of the debate to tilt towards the extremes. I mean, one of the curious things about the Brexit debate was the way in which the pro-Brexit camp in Parliament very quickly migrated towards the sort of hard Brexit side of the spectrum, and the way the sort of Remain camp in Parliament migrated towards the second referendum and no Brexit side of the spectrum. It was amazing how unpopulated the centre ground became. Lots of talks about sort of dirty tricks around this as well. You know, a couple of people who backed a softer Brexit have said that second referendum supporters guaranteed that they would vote in favour of single market. But the sort of depopulation of the centre ground was absolutely fundamental. Fatigue played a role, actually. I think, you know, the only reason why Boris Johnson's withdrawal agreement got approval in Parliament was because everyone had. I mean, and actually, one of the interesting things about Brexit is, for the best part of 4 years, we just weren't governed. I mean, nothing happened in Parliament. It's quite a remarkable period of time to be without government or legislation. So there's some of the reasons, I think. It's such a huge question. I mean, we could spend the whole hour going through the history of those, so I couldn't, I've got to leave that minute. But in principle, we could go through those 4 years in detail, but there's some of the reasons.
Okay, so let me move the debate right to the present. This week, I mean, Simon Coveney, the Irish Foreign Minister, has been talking about the threats that the EU could make in response to the possibility of terminating the trade and cooperation agreement. So how do you see this this playing out, this particular issue?
On the protocol, no one's ever said that to me before, I have to say. On the protocol, well, so we have a standoff on the Northern Ireland Protocol. I mean, if you want more details on that, just after, we can go into more detail. But essentially, the positions of the two sides are reconcilable as they stand. That is to say, the European Union has made certain concessions and gone as far as it says it's willing to go. I should say in parentheses that the package of measures that the Commissioner unveiled notionally to satisfy British demands amounted to far less than he indicated that they did, actually. So the Commission offer wasn't as generous as they flagged it as being, though actually for once in the Brexit process, the Commission won the PR on that and gave pressure. The The UK government, on the other side, has moved on from worrying about the practical on-the-ground impact of the protocol to worrying about something completely unconnected, which is the institutional setup under the protocol with a role for the European Court of Justice. There is no way the European Union can take the European Court of Justice out of the protocol because EU law applies directly in Northern Ireland. The ultimate arbiter of half my Antonian finish up about 50. The ultimate arbiter of EU law has to be the European Court of Justice, and if it isn't, the ECJ will strike down whatever they agree on as being contrary to EU law. So we've ended up in a situation where there's a standoff. Now, what we don't know, this could be long, we don't know if the British government is planning to use Article 16 of the protocol, though all the indications are that they will, because they kind of back themselves into a corner. I heard people saying today that there are second thoughts in number 10 about it, because they're not quite sure how that strategy plays out, but we'll see. But the second thing we're not sure about is if they use Article 16, how they use Article 16. Don't forget, Article 16 is part of the protocol. Okay, so it is perfectly legitimate under the terms of the protocol to deploy Article 16. You can deploy Article 16 in a narrow and focused way. You can say the rules about sausages aren't working for us, so we're going to use Article 16 to suspend them, or we need to come to some sort of solution. Or you can do it in a sort of mega way and say, actually, we're going to use Article 16 because we don't like the protocol, we're going to suspend the whole of it. If the UK government does the former, my suspicion is, not necessarily on sausages, that was just a random example, but if they did the former, a targeted deployment of Article 16, it's perfectly conceivable that the subsequent period of mediation will find that they've acted completely within the text of the protocol. Why? Because the protocol is an utterly stupid document, and Article 16 is the most stupid bit of all, because Article 16 basically says one of the reasons why you can deploy this article is in the event of trade diversion. Now that, at the time, struck me as odd, because the whole point of the protocol is to create trade diversion on one level. You are creating a border where there wasn't one. It is going to create trade diversion. So in a sense, Article 16, by mentioning trade diversion, gives the UK government an open door. What it doesn't give the UK government is any opportunity whatsoever to mention the European Court of Justice, because the position of the European Court of Justice is exactly as it was. Just put your hand up, I'm rolling on too long. The position of the European Court of Justice is exactly as it was when we signed the document. The European Court of Justice hasn't done anything with regard to the protocol, so there is no credible argument the British government could make about the European Court of Justice's role taking them by surprise, because it hasn't had a role. So we'll have to wait and see what the UK government does. I think we're a very long way away from suspension of the Trading Corporation. This is one of the problems with the media, is the media like to portray things as nuclear. There is nothing nuclear about how the European Union does it. It is process, it's negotiation, it is basically politics by boredom, okay? And it is exactly the same for the protocol in Article 16. There are processes. They're long-winded, hideous, incomprehensible processes. And those processes will start if Article 16 is used. There will be mediation, there will be negotiation. It'll be a long, long time before we get to the point where either side, I think, is thinking of taking retaliatory action, because we need to figure out first whether Article 16 has been used properly.
I'm sure there will be some questions about that. I'm going to touch on a few themes, and then maybe the audience will want to come back. So another question that I think is very much in people's minds is the impacts that Brexit is going to have, not just in terms of relations between GB and Northern Ireland, but thinking about the Union as a whole, and thinking about the impact that the process of Brexit may well have on the moves towards Scottish independence. Some would suggest that the process of Brexit has certainly given fuel to the fire of Nicola Sturgeon and others to make the case. Others would point out that what we've learned over the last last couple of years is that extricating yourself of a union that you've been part of for 4 decades is pretty difficult. Extricating yourself out of a union that you've been part of for for 300 years might be much harder. So how do you see the current state of the Brexit debate feeding into the prospects, the possibilities of Scottish independence?
There's a very good game of self-contradiction bingo to be played. As you watch Brexiters arguing that you're better off together and breaking up a union cost, and Scottish national politicians arguing that actually, having argued against Brexit for exactly those reasons, now saying that actually identity is more important than economics. And anyway, the economics is project fear anyway. Everyone is going to do a neat pirouette of 180 degrees and end up on the opposite side of essentially a very, very similar argument. But the way I tend to think about what Brexit has meant for Scotland is to say that Brexit and the subsequent process has strengthened the emotional case for Scottish independence quite strongly, and it's strengthened short-term political support for it. But it has made the practical case for Scottish independence a hell of a lot more complex than it was. So the emotional case is quite simple. We're dragged out of the European Union against our will by the bastard English who didn't listen to us, didn't consult us. They've almost gone out of their way to ignore us in the subsequent process. We are Scottish. We want to be part of the European Union. And so independence is the only way to do that. I mean, there are lots of subtexts. Remember, 35% of SNP voters voted Leave. So some of the things you hear about Scottish public opinion are way off the mark. But there has been no doubt, there was for a while at least, a slight strengthening of support for Scottish independence in the polls over the last 18 months or so. The practical case is if given the sort of Brexit that we've got, which means that Great Britain is outside the customs union and if Scotland leaves the UK and joins the European Union, there has to be a border between Scotland and England. We have that debate again. And firstly, when you sometimes hear Scotnat saying, "Ah, yes, but the EU have been very, very flexible about Northern Ireland. I'm sure they'll be flexible about Scotland." I think, quite frankly, they're wrong. The reason why the EU was flexible about Northern Ireland is, one, as a co-signatory of the GFA, two, because the vital national interests of a member state, the Republic, and three, because of the threat of sectarian violence. None of those conditions hold for Scotland, and the EU doesn't like making exceptions. So then, with the prospect of that border, I mean, there are lots of things about that border. First, the psychology of a border between Scotland and England, but the economics are quite grim too. There was a nice piece of work done by Centre for Economic Performance at the LSE, I think about 8 months ago now. And one of the things they showed is that any benefits for the Scottish economy of joining the European Union would be lost. I mean, the scale of the two things is almost identical by the costs of the imposition of a border between Scotland, because England is Scotland's biggest trade. So that's the problem the SNP are having to wrestle with is, I mean, and actually, cynically, I think the reason why the SNP conference ended up being online only was because SNP ministers were quite keen not to confront their membership because, I mean, I remember the last time we went to an SNP conference 2 years ago, and SNP ministers were getting heckled from the floor for being too cautious about the timetable for independence. The members want to have a referendum now. The leadership are trying to figure out a slower, more cautious strategy that allows them to think through some of these practical issues.
Let me raise one other big set of issues, and then we can. I'm very happy to come to the first sort of set of questions from the floor, and that is reflecting on the extent to which Brexit has really changed British politics. I mean, we think about the work of Sobolew's going forward, for example, Brexit land, really emphasizing how important that distinction between Remainers and Leavers, and indeed in another fantastic book available for more than 80p probably, which you can also talk about, which emphasize these divisions of politics. What's interesting to reflect on as political scientists is how far those divisions are continuing and perpetuating. And I guess what's also interesting to reflect on here is that so much else has happened in politics in the last couple of years, particularly with regard to the pandemic, that it's often sort of masked a little bit about the impact that that Brexit has had. So I wonder whether you sense as if that division between Remainers and Leavers is still such a central driving force of politics, or whether you sense that that's actually on the wane, and maybe other factors are coming back to the fore and being important in driving politics.
Can we just park the bit about the effects of Brexit being hidden, because that's a sort of slightly separate question, but it's worth talking about because I think it's important. But I mean, the British social attitudes, the new survey came out a couple of weeks ago, and the evidence in there is perfectly clear that the Leave Remain divide remains every bit as stark as it was during the Brexit process, if you like. And if you read Rob Ford and Maria Sobolewska's book, you will realize that actually Brexit didn't create a new divide, it simply activated and gave identity to a debate that had haunted British politics since the 60s, they argue. That liberal versus conservative divide on social values has always been there. It's one of the reasons why, for instance, New Labour hemorrhaged voters. I mean, we forget this too often, that, you know, New Labour lost, I think, well over 1 million votes in 2001 to people who just thought this is not for me anymore and stopped voting. So that was partly this values division playing out. So Brexit didn't create this, but Brexit gave it a label. Brexit gave it an identity. You weren't just one side or the other of a sort of mushy debate. You were a Leaver or a Remainer. And there's been some fascinating research about that divide. I mean, Sarah Hobolt at the LSE did this survey stuff a couple of years ago, and I mean, it would be funny if it wasn't so sad, but they found that 56% of Remainers wouldn't rent a room in their house to a Leave voter. And sort of 55% of Remainers would be very upset or quite upset if one of their kids married a Leave voter. So there's real deep polarization. And it is still the case today that more people identify as a Leaver or Remainer than identify with a political party. So that's there. What does that mean for our politics? Well, it mattered immensely in the 2019 election, mixed up with a whole host of other things, notably Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, what Labour spectacularly managed to do in 2019 was lose Leave voters and Remain voters. So what we can deduce from that is a Labour Brexit strategy was an absolute farce and a failure. What the Conservatives did was essentially build a Leave coalition. If you look at British election study data, 83% of the people who voted Conservative were Leave supporters. And that was the success of Boris Johnson, was to create a new coalition. Now, the interesting question, to which I'm sorry about this, I don't really know the answer, but it is the question we should be asking ourselves, is will that situation persist? As long as that situation persists, and the Conservatives are in a strong position electorally. But there's no reason why it should, and whether it does or not is going to hinge, I think, on what happens to the economy over the next couple of years. It's perfectly easy to imagine that if we're in the spring and summer of next year facing something that more obviously looks like stagflation, so you have that combination of low growth and high inflation that was so crippling in the 1970s, voters, including Leave voters, are going to worry less about immigration or Brexit and going to start worrying more about economic issues. And if they do, then actually that signals problems for the Conservative Party, because the Conservative coalition, whilst it is a very stable values coalition, is an absolutely appallingly fragile economic coalition, because as we're starting to see in Parliament, your average red wall Tory voter has very different economic preferences to your average Shire Tory. And putting together an economic policy in times of hardship, which requires difficult decisions and cuts or tax rises, but doing that in a way that holds that coalition together is going to be all but impossible. So I think the economy is key to whether Brexit continues. I mean, the Brexit divide isn't going away. It's not going to disappear in the short term, because those identities are real, they're strongly felt, and they will continue to play a role in our politics. But whether that becomes the crucial driver of voter choice I think will hinge on economic performance.
And did you want to come back to the issue about the impacts of Brexit being hidden or not?
Yeah, I mean, in that sense, the government's been quite lucky because the pandemic has hidden, in a number of different ways, it's hidden a lot of the impacts of Brexit. So it's hidden the impacts of Brexit because the economy's performed so weirdly during lockdown and after lockdown that it is virtually impossible to sort of figure out which bit of all that was Brexit. Anyone who understands the basics of trade knows there's a Brexit effect, but no one, I don't think, can actually isolate it from the broader COVID effects. And of course, the pandemic also means that many people haven't felt the effects of Brexit yet. If you think about service providers, whether it's academics, lawyers, architects, or even, Roger Daltrey, people haven't been able to travel to provide services because of lockdown. And it's only when they start to travel again that they're going to run into that wall of bureaucracy that now awaits them. I mean, just anecdotally, a couple of my colleagues have recently cancelled trips to go to the College of Europe, one in Poland, one in Bruges, because they couldn't figure out what the visa requirements were to get paid for the course they were going to go and teach. Now, that's not going to bring the world economy down if a couple of academics can't go and teach a course. But if you broaden that out to service providers in general, and services are where we have our trade surplus with the European Union, then that is going to be a big deal. And we haven't begun to confront the implications of that yet because people haven't been traveling.
Great. I'd like to open it up for some questions. We have one through in the chat already, but I can see 2 or 3 hands already. I think Tony Arnold has the first question. Tony?
Thank you. Thank you. Enjoyed your talk, Anand. You referred to Theresa May's incompetence in the course of your remarks. Does my memory fail me, or was there not a point when Parliament was having that painful journey through the three separate votes, when if the Labour Party had been prepared to support Theresa May, the outcome of the whole process might have been significantly different? That's my first question. And then my second one is just a flippant observation, but that it would be great fun if the UK became the first member state to win a case under Article 16 against the EU.
On the second, absolutely. And I think so much of the sort of rather fevered debate around this misses this point. I'm going to answer them as they come, if that's okay, just because I won't remember otherwise. So yeah, you're quite right. On the first, yes, there are a whole load of what-ifs about that. What I would say is that you just had, and this was haunting many Labour MPs, Change UK, or whatever they were then called, had just appeared on the scene. You have opinion polling, I mean, you remember what happened in the European elections, that is scaring the bejesus out of both parties, both big parties. And Labour MPs genuinely thought that if we get on board with Theresa May now, the danger was that a load of, or the perceived danger at the time, we can discuss whether it was real or not, was that a load of Labour MPs would leave the party and join the new grouping because the Labour Party was backing Brexit. You could turn that on its head and say, actually, if they'd managed to do that and hold the party together, the party that would have split would have been the Conservative Party, because the Spartans would have left and probably made common cause with Nigel Farage. But that was the fear, I think, of the Labour Party. And we've got this thing on our website called the Brexit Archive, where we interview people who were involved in the Brexit process. And I think it was Gavin Barwell said, no, it was David Livingstone was saying, they had negotiations between Number 10 and the Labour Party to see what concessions between the second and third vote the government could give to persuade Labour MPs to sign up. And David said, we basically gave them everything they asked for. You know, we gave them the guarantees on social and economic stuff. We even gave them the chance to amend the legislation to add a referendum on second reading if they wanted. There was nothing we said no to. But even then, they wouldn't make common cause with us because they were so worried about defending that Remain flank. When I was talking about incompetence, I think there are several things. I think firstly, she said things without understanding what they meant. I think that's very true of the party conference speech of 2016. It's equally true of Lancaster House. And in a way, which is credit to, I mean, the fact is she learned. She spent much of the rest of her premiership rowing back from things she said earlier on because she was starting to realize the consequences of what she'd said, okay? But secondly, I mean, and this astounds me to this day, she signed the withdrawal agreement with the European Union. Now, leave aside the substance of what you think about Brexit. It was a remarkable document, that withdrawal agreement. And it was remarkable, A, because it squared a lot of circles that looked unsquareable. And it was remarkable, B, because Theresa May managed to get from the European Union concessions that the European Union didn't want to give. The all UK backstop was something many member states were profoundly uneasy about. Okay, so, but then she came back to the UK and I think she said, I'm going to go to Scotland for a day and Wales for a day, which was bizarre because we weren't having a referendum, but spent very, very little time rolling the pitch with MPs in the House of Commons, getting supporters mobilised. The only supporter in the House of Commons she ended up with was Rory Stewart. And actually, as an exercise in parliamentary management, it was abject. Once you've got that deal, I would have expected a PR blitz from number 10 to sell it. And actually, she came back with a deal and they went absolutely silent. So that's one of the things I mean by incompetence.
Thank you. Sotiris?
Yes, thank you, and welcome back to another event. Nice to see you after 2 years. So, yeah, my question is, like, we're living through this, like, Weimar-style Brexit republic, I think. But my question is about the role of ignorance. You talked about incompetence, and I would probably agree a little bit that, I would, even though I didn't like her at all, I think she was not less incompetent than David Cameron or Boris Johnson. Actually, I think she was much more competent than both of these people. But I was just wondering, like, do you think that the UK and other countries suffer from a problem of ignorance? And what I would say in terms of, like, the ignorance of the repercussions of what they're doing. So Cameron started on a campaign to renegotiate, and whoever has studied the EU politics, even on an undergraduate level, I hope that they realize that you cannot take away the freedom of movement because this was agreed in 1992 or not one. So saying that, oh, I want an exception after 30 years, it sounds a bit ridiculous in my opinion. So we knew that he wouldn't be getting anything. Then Brexit means Brexit. Then call the referendum. Brexit brings Brexit. Then have Boris Johnson go for a hard Brexit. It's just like, the Labour Party and all the other stuff, the voters, the fishermen, the farmers voting for Brexit. Like, I just see a lot of people doing so much self-harm to themselves, to the country, to the parties, to the economy. And I just wonder, is it an ideological issue? Is it an issue of arrogance? We are British and nobody can stop us. But I just feel that there's a massive problem of ignorance of how the European Union works, how the world works, and what are the actions that the UK takes, including what they're going to be doing with this Article 16, which I think is going to be another crime down the path of Northern Ireland. So I just wonder, do you think there's a problem there, or just they know what they're doing, you think?
Let me go through that in stages. I mean, the first thing I'd say is, the Eurobarometer does this, what do you know about the European Union? And the Brits have been very proudly last, I think, in all, bar a couple of them. So, yeah, but I mean, I don't think the level of knowledge of how the European Union works in other member states is great. I don't think our level of knowledge in general, I mean, who amongst us can put our hands up and say, when we go and vote in an election, we understand the tax code? And, tax is a really serious, salient issue when it comes to elections, but actually most of us guess or sort of think, okay, top line of tax, what does that mean? Voters don't know stuff in general. The other thing I would say is, it is genuinely the case that some people voted for Brexit either knowing or worrying that it might cause economic ill effects. I mean, one of the things that I find odd, I mean, there's a sort of class snobbery about this sometimes, which is that middle class people who vote to pay higher taxes are enlightened. Working class people who vote for Brexit, even though it causes economic harm, are idiots. And it is, I think, we've done enough focus groups to know that there are many people who voted leave who did so knowing that it might not have great economic consequences, but there was something beyond economics that they were interested in there. I think when you're talking about different political leaders, it's different stuff, isn't it? I think with David Cameron, it's hubris. David Cameron just thought he'd win. David Cameron thought he'd always win. And I don't think it crossed his mind, even on the day, you know, when Andrew Cooper's telling him we're 10 points clear. I don't think it crossed his mind that he was going to lose. So I just think he assumed we'll do this and it'll work. Curiously, in parentheses, David Cameron's number 10 used Scotland as the model for the campaign because Scotland had worked. The Nats started the Scottish independence referendum polling at 25%. They ended it on 45%. Portraying that as a success strikes me as slightly odd, to say the least. And a final word on Boris Johnson. Politically, the man isn't incompetent. The man's a genius. He never, ever loses. Now, Boris Johnson very clearly prioritizes politics over policy. And one of the interesting questions for political scientists, I think, is how long you can keep doing that and getting away with it. I suspect the answer is a lot longer than most of us would guess. But if the job of a politician is to win elections, I don't think you can call Boris Johnson incompetent. I mean, you can call him all sorts of things legitimately. But actually, when it comes to that central task of winning elections, he's actually pretty bloody good at it. And if you think that they're still ahead in the polls, or neck and neck, and you know, if you were to say, at this point in time, all things being equal, if I forced you to bet on the next election, the fact that you would think hard about it is a tribute to his political leadership and his ability to attract voters. So I think you're right on the technical stuff. I don't think he cares. Whether Cummings is right or not about how he approached the Northern Ireland Protocol. But, you know, I remember going into number 10 in December 2019, straight after the general election, and being utterly floored by the fact that I spoke to 3 people there, and every single one of them talked about re-election. This is like 2 weeks after the election. They are obsessed with the politics. That's what drives them.
Patrick?
Hello.
Great to see you. Can I put 2 quick propositions to see what you think?
Mm-hmm.
First one on the Labour side, or on the left progressive side of British politics. I remember quite a dismissive remark by Peter Mandelson in about 2009 when someone was pointing out the loss or the alienation and disappointment of large swathes of kind of the underclass, the working class. And his response was, well, where else are they going to go? Mm-hmm. And a simple answer is, well, they did go somewhere. They went to Farage, not so much in the 4 million votes for UKIP, whatever it was, but Brexit became a kind of revolt, an extra parliamentary revolt outside the system that Mandelson couldn't imagine. On the other side, on the side of the right, I noticed I was at an event where there was quite a lot of conservative writers, and it struck me that Brexit had become something that was almost entirely not about the European Union at all. Mm-hmm. It had become the next big thing after anti-communism around which you can mobilise and unite. That in British conservative circles, there is somewhat fundamental intramural disagreement about foreign policy, about economics, about the role of the state, about taxes, about personal morality, all sorts, sexual identity, everything. This was a big totem. And between the Farage defection out of alienation and between Brexit as the new faith, things like fisheries or agricultural subsidies or freedom movement become almost incidental. Am I overstating the case in terms of what draws people to these positions?
I think, deal with the second part first. I think for a lot of on the Leave side, they were largely incidental. I remember, sorry, I'm just going to make this a series of anecdotes, but I remember Catherine Barnard and I were in the House of Commons for some discussion with Tory MPs about the future of agriculture after Brexit. It was about 2017. And they almost ended up coming to blows with each other, because what you had is a few people there who were saying, Brexit, brilliant, we can slash all subsidies, we can get rid of all tariffs, we can have cheap food. And everyone else is going, you know, sod off, I'm in a rural constituency, I'll never win another election. So there was a very, very profound division within the Conservative Party on these matters. And we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of some of the very profound policy choices we're going to have to make post-Brexit. I don't think it's crossed people's minds as yet. So yeah, it was a unifying force, but unifying within constraints, because remember, Boris Johnson didn't just change the electoral base of his party, he changed the parliamentary base of his party by kicking out anyone who was on the Liberal side. So the nature of Conservative MPs is very, very different now to what it was then. On the Labour side, I mean, for me, through all of this, one of the facts that sticks in my mind is 2.8 million people voted in the referendum who were eligible to vote in 2015 but didn't. So in this sense, a lot of people who dropped out of politics came back in just for that referendum. There's a little bit of scattered evidence that not many of them kept going. Actually, one of the interesting things about 2019 is Labour suffered from a big fall of turnout in red wall seats. It's not as simple as Labour voters turning to the Conservatives. A lot of Labour voters didn't actually get out and vote at all. So, yeah, there was that. One of the greatest ironies for me of the referendum was the fact that Matthew Elliott was chief executive of Vote Leave. And I got their text alerts in the referendum campaign. I remember in the last 4 or 5 days before the referendum, there were sort of series of texts from the Leave campaign saying, this is the one chance you have to make your vote count. You know, this isn't like an election with safe seats. This is a referendum where every single vote counts equally. And it made me laugh because Matthew Elliott had also been chief exec of the No to AV campaign, where he'd argued that the electoral system is perfectly fine and every vote counts. So he did a bit of a UE between 2011 and 2016 on how effective our electoral system is. But I think that message got through. I mean, you know, from the accounts of queues in council estates of people who never voted, queuing up to vote. And I think just one more thing. I think, you know, it is wrong to say that UK-EU relations had nothing to do with the Leave vote. But I think it is absolutely fair to say there was a lot more to it than that. I mean, one thing that always strikes me is it wasn't a coincidence that the Leave bus was red and said NHS and money on the side, because that bus just went round exactly those places where people had defected from the Labour Party, either not to vote or to vote UKIP, and that bus was for them.
Great. We have a few questions here, which I'll come to. I'd like to take one question from actually a former PhD student of ours, Josephine, who asks, where do you actually locate the after in Britain after Brexit? What's the reference point? 23rd of June 2016, 29th of March 2017, 31st of January 2020, 31st of December 2020, and will Brexit, in quotation, in inverted commas, ever end, she asks.
I suppose the simple answer is no, not in the short to medium term, it won't end, because, you know, in a sense, the Eurosceptics always had it right, that the relationship between a member state and the European Union is a very, very deep and complicated one that kind of inveigles its way into every bit of your national life. And there are also, if you think about the things that Brexit has left open to question, there's the devolution settlement, which was predicated on EU membership to ensure that the Scots and the Welsh and the Northern Irish could have different regulations, but there wouldn't be a need for boundaries because we would all be members of the single market and the customs union, to the way our economy functions. And the impact that Brexit is going to have on some sectors. I mean, we talked about fisheries and agriculture. We can talk about the City of London. We can talk about the political dynamics of the levelling up agenda. But that whole thing, we can talk about what it means for our politics. We can talk about what it means for our relationship with the European Union. That's going to take a good decade to sort out, minimum, I would have thought, before we settle into anything that is recognisably a stable equilibrium. And then, of course, there are our relations with the rest of the world, which is also part of this Brexit saga because of the whole global Britain thing. So in a way, no. I mean, after Brexit, you can say after we've left the European Union, but the implications of this, I mean, I always liken Brexit to taking a very big stone and chucking it into a very still pond. And those ripples are going to be there for a long, long time to come. And we might even, I think what we'll do is we'll start dealing with Brexit issues and call them something else. But the issues of how we regulate our economy, whether we want to diverge from the European Union when it comes to regulation, even though that implies costs. One of the most interesting, I mean, this reflects badly on me that I'm saying this is interesting, is the fact that we are diverging from the European Union without doing anything because the EU keeps changing its rule book. But no one in government is keeping a track of this. And it's going to be the poor people who trade with the European Union who end up facing restrictions that they never even knew about because the government never knew about it because the EU have changed their laws and we don't do scrutiny anymore. Those sorts of things are going to be with us for the foreseeable future, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Nicholas, I think. Nicholas?
Perfect.
Yes,
Thanks.
you have a
Good
question.
afternoon.
Hi.
I have a set of two hypothetical questions just to exercise a little of futurology, as we say in Spanish. Well, you've said that there's still polarization between leavers and remainers. That's interesting, and that's a current debate still. In that sense, what's the possibility, in your opinion, of a second referendum? Is there any institutional arrangement that you see in place to turn over the decision in the short to medium term? Even much so if in the future the people start feeling economic turmoil, let's say, or feel the genuine and practical effects of Brexit that you said they are not feeling right now. That's my first question. And my second question would be, if the decision is somehow turned over by some mechanism that probably you don't know, I don't know either, right? You see possibilities for the UK to be readmitted. You've also said that the EU doesn't like to review their rules, right? So it's not, probably it's a thing of both interest of both sides, right? Those would be my questions.
I mean, can I go? Yes. Is that okay? I think we should probably call it a third referendum, the next one, seeing as we've had two. We forget about the first one. I see no prospect whatsoever of the UK thinking about rejoining the European Union, even being an issue in political debate for at least a couple of parliaments and possibly longer, because what it would take is for one of the big parties to adopt that as a policy, for it to get on the agenda, and I just don't see that happening in the near future. If we were to think about rejoining, it would have to be via a referendum. What the polling we have, and it's dodgy polling because it's about a hypothetical, suggests is that whilst there is a significant gap between the people who think Brexit was a mistake and those who don't, there is still a majority that wouldn't vote to rejoin because, for a variety of reasons, because a lot of people who think it was a mistake think that we voted to leave, so we should honour that. When it comes to rejoining, who knows? I mean, it depends when this happens and under what conditions. I mean, the EU at the moment seems to think it is too busy and it's too complicated to take in a Serbia. I mean, if they find Serbia indigestible, you've got to think that they'd find the UK wholly indigestible. The one thing we can be fairly certain about is that if the UK were to apply to rejoin, it wouldn't get the opt-outs it got when it was in last time. So whether it's Euro, whether it's Schengen, whether it's the budget rebate, those things aren't going to be on the table again. But I think I would be amazed if we were having a serious political debate about rejoining. I'd be amazed if we weren't anywhere near having a referendum on rejoining in my lifetime, as things stand now, which is a very, very important caveat.
We hope you live for a long time.
Not long.
No, but that's what we're yeah. Anyway,
Anand, welcome back to Birmingham. And my question addresses exactly what you just talked about, and it's partly just examining the curiosity of that. Brexit primarily was an electoral strategy for Boris Johnson personally and for the Conservative Party to neutralise the Brexit Party on the right, and has been very successful in doing so, creating a vacuum on the right, so allowing Johnson to move to the left on a variety of issues, and to poleaxe the opposition. And it's a one which will be a successful electoral strategy for the Conservatives if the Scottish Nationalists get their way and they leave, reducing the anti-Tory votes in the House of Commons. So permanent Conservative governments are a likely consequence long-term of Brexit. But my question comes from that is that I don't think it's self-evident that the conclusions that Keir Starmer and the rest have drawn from that are the right politics or the right for the country.
I understand the concern with working class Brexit supporters, but we have a situation where Brexit is a disaster on every front possible, in my reading of it. And yet we have no willingness to go anywhere near those politics, to pick up those issues, to pick up that cudgel that he could bludgeon this government with and point out that the massive damage that's been done across the board to our international reputation, to our economy, to our society, and the like. And in fact, if it was the case that that was picked up as a cudgel, it would allow the Tory party to split for the Spartans and for the Brexiters Brexit party to come back again, and it would potentially allow the continuation of the UK as a union, leaving open the possibility of a future Labour government or a Labour-Scott-Nat government. So to me, it's not necessarily obvious why that conclusion is reached politically, other than a lack of backbone, if you like, actually to grasp the issue and go with it. The country is split. The country, there is a constituency to be built there. Do you think it needs a realignment of British politics in order to make to make Brexit a fighting issue? I mean, if you go back to 2016, on that night before the votes were finally tallied, Farage was saying, we won't let this stand. We'll come back to this. We'll have another referendum immediately if it's very close. And yet, I'm just grasping with it. Why is it that there seems to be capitulation on the side of the main advocates of Remain?
I think the stark and simple answer to that is electoral geography. Whilst the vote itself was close, there were significantly more constituencies that had majority leave than majority Remain. Because the fact of the matter is, Remain voters are piled high in certain geographic areas, whereas the Leave vote is more evenly split around the country. And that's the simple calculation. There is no path to power with the current electoral geography of the United Kingdom for the Labour Party as a party of Remain, rejoin, whatever you want to call it. It just simply doesn't add up because of the way our country is structured geographically. And I think that is the simplest explanation of what Keir Starmer is doing. Well, yeah, except of course I remain unconvinced that any party that wins a majority on the first past the post is then going to introduce proportional representation. Because of course, as soon as I've just been watching the Blair Brown program, and that sort of sense that you are invulnerable because you're in power and when you're winning, you're winning. And the last thing you want to do when you win at something is change the rules that helped you win. But yeah, I mean, PR would obviously be a massive change and would change that balance, because geography would, depending on the system, be significantly less important. But I don't think it's crazy of Keir Starmer to have adopted the position he's adopted, assuming that his primary objective is to become elected, which I assume it is.
Julie's been waiting patiently.
Oh, no, not patient.
It's very unlike her.
Hi, Anand. I want to add something on to David's question, because I agree with the electoral system response, but you've also answered that question in a different way already, in the sense that in 2016, Johnson got Brexit done. Brexit's done. So why would we, from many of the electorate, why would we return to it? We've got a weakened parliament who've been bashed and bruised by Brexit, now a distance from Brexit. And then if you think about the longer term issues like farming, they're going to be wrapped up with climate change questions, and questions that really, again, overtake the Brexit issue. So I guess my question is, even in lifetimes beyond yours, where is that political space that calls to account the medium and long-term impact of Brexit? Because I can't see it.
Well, I suppose, if you go back to the 60s, if you see a very clear divergent economic trajectory between the UK and the eurozone, that might spark that conversation. I have very little confidence in the eurozone as an economic area, it seems to me, so I'm not sure that's going to come anytime soon. So no, I don't see what the spark will be to trigger that. Now, one interesting thing about what you said is, Boris Johnson got Brexit done. Now, it'd be interesting to see if the government chooses to reopen the protocol withdrawal agreement, if it goes down the Article 16 route, and therefore Brexit, which was meant to have been done. And what Boris Johnson didn't say is, I'm going to get Brexit done with an asterisk unless I decide to open up the deal that I signed and have an endless row with the European Union, which will lead to even more economic damage because they might impose tariffs on us. He didn't say that. What we don't know is whether there is a niche there for Keir Starmer. And the Labour Party have started, haven't they? Make Brexit work. He said that very deliberately 2 or 3 times on Mar, I think it was, last weekend. And that's clearly the strategy, is the hope that essentially, if you can portray the Conservative Party as the party that gives you Brexiternity, and the Labour Party is the party that will sort this out once and for all, because Christ knows we've had enough of it, we want it dealt with. Whether you get some kind of realignment around that, we don't know. What we do know is that those Leave Remain identities are very, very sticky indeed. And as you know, as we saw that YouGov tracker, which was the longest running tracker about was voting to leave the European Union the right decision or the wrong decision, and as wrong became the majority, if you dug into the figures, the reason that happened was not because Leave voters were changing their minds. It's because, crudely put, Leave voters were dying and Remain supporters were hitting the age of 18. It was demographic change rather than people changing their minds. People have been remarkably slow to change their minds about Brexit.
I have a question over here. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question about just Britain just before Brexit.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about the Labour Party strategy in 2019, which was a complete mess. But one side of it that seems to have been completely forgotten is there wasn't just trying to reconcile ideological Remainers and Leavers. There was also the Lexit part of it with Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell, and a few others coming from a left-wing criticism of the EU and being shut down every time they were, dared to utter something along those lines. Do you think they could have done anything differently at the time to stake out a more sensible left exit position, which would have both covered some of the Leave voters, addressed some of the problems that the Conservative Party and Brexit Party and others were tapping into, while kind of offering, I guess, something to the Remainers as well? So yeah, could
during the referendum, you mean?
Well, around 2019, I mean.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, once 2017 to 19, basically. Could they have done something differently to stake out a legitimate Lexit position, or was the mess of a strategy that they had in 2019 just the best that could be done given the political constraints that existed at the time?
God, I don't know. I mean, in a sense, I mean, there are two layers to that, aren't there? The Lexit critique of the European Union requires you to be a member state to carry out some pretty profound reforms to how the European Union works. That is to say, there is a credible argument. I don't think very many Labour MPs actually, I don't think John McDonnell thought that, to be honest. Corbyn might have done, but I don't think there were that many Labour MPs who really genuinely believed in the Lexit cause. And remember, one of the bits of Brexit was the sort of economic inequality thing, which we could easily have addressed. We could have had the debate about levelling up in 2001, but we didn't. One of the most profound impacts of the Brexit referendum was something that had nothing whatsoever to do with EU membership. In fact, you could credibly argue that levelling up is harder with a GDP that is smaller than it would otherwise have been. But it's put it on the political agenda. I mean, it's not beyond the realms of possibility. I don't want you to get the impression that I'm in any way, shape or form an optimist, because I'm not. But I suppose it's not beyond the realms of possibility that 15 years hence, we have a UK economy that is smaller than it would have been had we remained a member state of the European Union, but less unequal than it would have been had we carried on the way we were before that referendum. Which is partly an answer to some of the Lexit critiques, isn't it, by a Conservative government at the moment.
So we have a couple of questions through on the chat. So one from our colleague Mawita, and Mawita asks, what impact is the turbulent relationship between the EU and the UK after Brexit having on the global Britain agenda of the Boris Johnson government?
At the moment, it's grist to the mill, because Liz Truss can go around talking about partnerships and not mentioning Europe. I think, you know, events will be what are key to this. I mean, for instance, you know, for all the noise in the Franco-British relationship, well, let's not forget that the UK is still working quite closely with France in the Sahel. But imagine we had another Libya crisis. I don't mean a crisis in Libya, but I mean a crisis that is essentially too big for the European Union and too small for the United States, which is what Libya was. The French and the British are going to have to work together, and I suspect that they probably would. So events can change that. But for the moment, I don't think it makes a great deal of difference, because we're not confronted with a situation where we're having to work with the European Union despite it all. You know, the Foreign Secretary is traveling around East Asia, putting photos on her Instagram feed and talking about global Britain, and that activism, in a sense, is going down quite well with Leave voters, because there are no really difficult choices that are confronting us. So, I mean, there are lots of difficult choices, but nothing so immediate as to throw into sharp relief the fact that we actually need to collaborate with the European Union. The one thing I would say, slightly lost from sight, is that, of course, the integrated review, for all its talk about Indo-Pacific and all that, does say that Euro-Atlantic security is the core of our foreign policy interests, or it uses a phrase like that. So that is still there.
So just, I'll come to you in a sec, Kasia. There's just one other question that's come through on Q&A, which also talks about global issues. So maybe it's appropriate to follow on. So Nicholas Easton asks, how will Britain leaving the EU impact the global market alongside global trade? What is the future of the UK in terms of making trade deals with different nations? What are the implications of the UK leaving the European Union on the position of the UK within the global market?
The UK doesn't impact the global economy that significantly. We're a very, very small part of the global economy. And again, the impacts of Brexit, insofar as there are any, will be completely dwarfed by the impacts of COVID, both in terms of the impact that COVID has already had on world trade and in terms of the political response to COVID, which has been talk about reshoring and so on. So globalization is going to look a whole lot less global, I would think, over the next few years. In terms of UK trade deals, yep, it's great to have trade deals, but just bear in mind, the economic impact of those trade deals will be trivial compared to the economic impact of Brexit, simply because of geography. George Osborne used to say, I mean, and he was right when he was saying it in opposition. I think it became wrong in 2011, but it's still worth citing this because it's quite an eye-opener. He used to point out that the United Kingdom traded more with the Republic of Ireland than it did with all the BRICS combined. So Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Our trade was greater with the Republic than with all of those economies. And, you know, those two numbers are still a lot closer than I think many people would guess. Not because the Republic of Ireland is growing faster than China, not because the Republic of Ireland has a bigger economy than any of those countries, but because the Republic of Ireland is next door. And you can say the word technology as often as you like, but it is still a fact of international trade that you trade a hell of a lot more with countries that are closer to you than you do with countries that are further away. In fact, someone showed me a couple of weeks ago an article in an economics journal which showed that there is a geographical bias to trade on eBay. That is to say, people prefer to buy stuff from closer to home, even when they're doing it digitally, because of postage costs, because of language, because of a whole host of things. So trade deals have a merit. One of those merits is that they're good for trade. The other, as Liz Truss is making clear, is they can help cement relationships with countries who you want alliances with. But they're not going to make up for Brexit just because of that simple fact of geography.
Kasia.
Thank you very much. Two questions. One is really following up on basically the UK and third countries, if we call them like that. What is interesting that you said that in the UK we've hardly managed to scratch the surface when it comes to specific issues. What is fascinating about some of the trade deals, that what I would call extreme pragmatism, that when there are the countries which don't matter, the UK simply cuts and pastes from the existing EU agreements. He did it with Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. Ukrainians love it because it's a slimmed down association agreement with the best juicy bits in it, plus security. So it's piggybacking on the EU agreements, which means there are some references to the acquis, which means that the UK agreement with Ukraine refers to certain developments in EU relations, something which we don't cover it domestically, or we are not thinking about it. And this sort of pragmatism is fascinating, this almost a divorce between the domestic debates and policymaking versus the external dimension. And how do we explain this? Because there are different people working on it, or it's just pragmatism and because it's trivial, the impact, the trade impact, or dimension is trivial. That's the first question, technical. The second, it's going to be a bit more personal. You've been working on the EU for a long time. You call it the politics of boredom. Have you had any strategic surprises when it comes to EU's sort of behavior towards Britain and Brexit? Has the EU delivered on what you said, or have you been actually surprised in any way how the EU has acted vis-a-vis the UK?
I was surprised they signed the withdrawal agreement with Theresa May. I didn't think they'd give that concession, and I was appalled by how they acted at Salzburg, because I've been surprised actually by the way in which emotion intrudes on how the EU has acted more than I would have thought. I think Salzburg is one example, and the incident where the Commission was talking about triggering Article 16 over vaccines was another, where actually we got under their skins to a far greater extent on those occasions than I thought would happen. I thought the EU wouldn't do that. So those have been surprises. I don't think I ever thought the EU would be divided or the member states would take ours. That was just silly talk, to be honest. So those are the things I think. The sort of if you think back to that Salzburg summit, the whole Tusk Instagram stuff and all that sort of stuff was so undiplomatic, so unhelpful, and so negative in terms of undermining a prime minister who actually they needed to succeed. That wasn't great. On the trade deals, I mean, there's a difference between the rollover trade deals and the new trade deals. Of course, we don't have many of the latter. We have an awful lot of the former. You're quite right. There have been a couple of embarrassing incidents where the DIT have had to revisit those things precisely because we've had to Tipex out, references to the acquis and stuff like that. They've slipped through because we have cut and pasted. How we explain this, I think, is perfectly simple. For this government, politics is, to a significant extent, performative. So it's not necessarily about results. Trade deals, to a significant extent, are not about what they do for trade or the domestic economy, because we haven't begun to think through. If you were doing this rationally, you would have a model for your domestic economy, and you would go out and sign trade deals that reinforce that direction of travel. We don't know what we're going to do with agriculture. I mean, Julie's a lot more confident, apparently, that the net zero stuff will figure in agricultural. All right, okay. But we don't know what the future of agriculture in this country is. All we know is we want to sign a trade deal with Australia because we can wave it around in the House of Commons and say we've got a trade deal with Australia. Actually, the less these trade deals do, cynically, the better. Because if they're real trade deals with real impacts, we're going to have to start making some domestic adjustments and facing the trade-offs that come with trade deals. We don't want that. What we want is the bit of paper. We want to wave it around. And they do it superbly well. My God, Liz Truss has flourished. I mean, Liz Truss, the avowed Remainer, go back and watch videos of Liz Truss from the referendum campaign, has become one of the greatest beneficiaries of global Britain and of Brexit because she's made it performance art. Okay, and if performance art keeps your vote base happy, you wouldn't sniff at it if you're a politician. But I think that's the crux of it. Is no one the DIT, you hear all the stories from DIT that they have all the analysts there working away, doing their studies, send it upstairs. Upstairs says, well, this is old-fashioned gravity, but we've moved beyond geography now, do it again. And no one listens to that stuff. Either you have forecasts and don't talk about them, or you have forecasts and cast doubt on them, or you have forecasts and completely ignore them. I mean, you know, the OBR, when the budget came out, that 4% figure on Brexit next to the 2% figure on COVID was not mentioned by the Chancellor. What other occasion has there been when a net 4% negative impact on the economy doesn't mention a single word in the budget speech? I mean, it's quite remarkable.
So hello. So first of all, thank you very much for the insightful talk. So I'm Bruno. I'm a PhD student in POLSIS, and I want to add a bit to this discussion about Global Britain. So as you mentioned, there was this integrated review with the tilts to the Indo-Pacific. There was also the deployment of this carrier strike group to the Indo-Pacific as well, and also this agreements between Australia and the US regarding the construction of nuclear submarines. So my question is, do you see a kind of a maritime narrative underpinning the concept of Global Britain, kind of as if Global Britain was the continuation of Brexit by other means or something like this? Do you see the way of this maritime dimension kind of, you know, going back to the time when Britain was an empire who used to rule the wave, and this imaginary regarding this past?
There's certainly a bit of, I mean, you know, the cynical side of me wants to say it's, you know, maritime without really having a navy, which is problematic. But it's partly that sort of nostalgia for, it certainly was for some Brexit voters. I think more to the point, the analogy here, I think, is when the French left the integrated commands of NATO. The French then spent the next few years desperately being very, very forceful in their denunciations of the Soviet Union and their declarations of loyalty to the Western Alliance, because they were worried that their decision would be seen as somehow a retreat from Western solidarity. And I think in the same way, the government doesn't want Brexit to be seen as the UK turning its back on the world. We still want to be considered a serious international player, you know, member of the Security Council, all that sort of stuff. So part of it is what the French and British have always been good at, which is international posturing, which is strutting your stuff so that people don't forget that you still exist. The Indo-Pacific thing makes perfect sense. I mean, we're not alone in that. I mean, the French were doing it. You know, Macron was in Sydney at the Opera House making a speech about France being an Indo-Pacific power, which had been looking for a map. And so, you know, that's where A, economic growth is going to be, and B, where we anticipate most of the future conflicts might well be. So it makes sense. Would it make more sense to do it collaborative? Yes, in practical terms, but actually that goes against the politics of it. I mean, one of the interesting variables here is how reliable a multilateralist is Joe Biden, and my instinctive reaction is not very at all.
There's one question on the chat which I didn't come to earlier, which I ought to have done, from Daniel Brown. He asks, how do you think Brexit will affect the mindset of people, and for how long?
Gosh, no idea how to answer that. It really pisses off my partner if I talk about it at home, I can tell you that. I mean, it's worth just stressing just how mad those few years were and what they did to the collective national psyche, because we'd have those conversations if we were going out for dinner with friends, and she'd be saying, you know, don't bloody go on about Brexit. It's like, I don't want to go on about Brexit. It's the weekend. I don't want to talk about it anymore. We'd sit down with friends in a restaurant and they'd say, so what's going on with the withdrawal agreement then? I'd sort of look at Nicola and think, am I allowed to answer a direct question, or should I just blank them all? I mean, the degree to which, from the referendum onwards, if you went round the country, people would be talking about it. I remember the other thing that was really funny was one of the projects we funded was this citizens' assembly to try and figure out what, after weekends of deliberation, what would British people come to as a solution for what kind of Brexit we should have. Okay, so that all went on. I remember being up in Manchester for the first or second weekend of it, and this little old lady with a broad Mancunian accent came over to me at tea time, and we were having a little chat. She said, you know, what I really wanted to talk to you about is I'm really worried about these Henry VIII powers. They got me really concerned. I thought, this is what Brexit has done now. You know, your average member of the public is concerned about, you know, statutory instruments. Brexit has had a massive impact, I think. Brexit has made people more interested in politics. I think the Hansard audit shows that. Brexit has made people simultaneously more cynical about democratic politics. You know, one of the most worrying findings from the last few years is the steep rise in the number of people in the Hansard audit who say we want a ruler who's capable of breaking the rules because of this sense that our system doesn't get things done. Where that goes, I think, will depend on what sort of next few years we as a country have. I mean, it's so weird because of the pandemic. But there is that sort of almost that sort of heightened sensibility around at the moment to things political that survey data gives evidence of from the general public as well. Where it goes, I don't know. I mean, bear in mind, if we do end up with a trade war with the European Union, that will, you know, it'll continue. So a part of it also depends on how the Brexit process goes. I hope that was, I didn't really understand the question, to be honest, which is, you can write some more if you want, and Tim will read it out to me.
Indeed, indeed. If you want to, Daniel, please do. Yes, David. Indeed. Sorry. Yes, David.
Bookshop, but Horizon Europe. So in the trade agreement, there was the potential for us to participate. We still haven't signed an agreement. Where are we up to? Is it likely, or is it just caught up in the dispute over Northern Ireland? I mean, there was even reports in the Telegraph recently that the UK might even walk away from it. So do you think we'll still end up participating?
I have no clue is the simple answer, but I do think it's a wonderful example of both sides acting like total idiots. The European Commission has sat on this, deliberately sat on it knowing that we want to be in it, because actually it is a point of leverage. And so they're dragging their feet on it. And the British government's wheeze is to say, well, look, if you don't give us what we want over the protocol, we'll hurt ourselves even more by withdrawing from something that benefits us disproportionately. So there we go. This is the state of bilateral diplomacy at the moment, sort of both sides playing silly buggers, which is a technical term. It's, you know, it's just being held to ransom now. I mean, we don't know yet what impact Brexit has on the university and research sectors. There's all sorts of anecdotal evidence about whether it's EU nationals, you know, withdrawing from job hunts here or going back to their home country or back to the eurozone. I mean, it'd be interesting if we ever got data on this. But it does seem to me, given the nature of scientific research, that it weakens our capability to do it without having access to a fund like that. And I heard the government, you know, I think that the same Telegraph article was saying that the British government is going to come up with its own alternative. You can't come up with your own alternative to something that includes 28 states by definition. And the whole point of it was it included 28 states. So it's a frustrating debate on all sides at the moment, I have to say. And you know, the other slightly worrying side is post-Cummings, we're hearing slightly less of the science superpower stuff. And we saw that in the spending review as well. So I think science is less of a priority now than it was when he was in Downing Street.
Okay, we have another question online. So Nicholas Easton asks, how will Brexit affect the European Union? What will be the biggest impacts of Brexit on foreign nations? Maybe I could, oh, he's just added an additional question to that. Adding on to my earlier question, perfect timing, Nicholas. What will be the biggest impacts of Brexit on nations that are remaining in the EU? I guess maybe if I can add into that, just to reflect on what you see the impact of the recent German elections might have on the future development of the EU. And obviously, lots of people are thinking about France and what may happen in France and how that may shape future developments of the EU. So maybe I'll throw that into the broader pot about how you see the EU and the EU side developing.
Right, let me start with the British thing. And if I forget your two at the end, just remind. Brexit makes the European Union weaker. I mean, that's the first thing you've got to say. It makes the economy smaller. It makes them weaker in international terms. So that's the first thing. There were two opposing claims made about Brexit and the European Union at the time, weren't there? The first is the EU will fall apart. Everyone will follow our lead and it will fall apart. And the second was without the Brits round the table saying no the whole time, we will forge ahead to ever closer union because those pesky sort of Brits won't be there blocking everything we try and do. Neither of those is true. The first one is not true because, well, A, they've watched Brexit. And I mean, think about the European Union and why other member states aren't going to try and emulate us. I mean, apart from having watched how difficult this process has been, firstly, most member states are small. Small countries aren't in the habit of leaving big clubs because big clubs make them feel secure. And actually, for many small countries, big clubs give them disproportionate influence and cash. So the cash point applies particularly to Poland and Hungary. There's a lot of nonsense being talked about them at the moment, I think. Secondly, if you thought Brexit was messy, imagine doing it if you were in the euro and having to get your national currency back at the same time. That would be an interesting exercise. And the third thing I think we never really grasped in this country is in all other member states of the European Union, EU membership is part of the political DNA of the country in a way it never ever was here. I mean, there are lots of examples of this. I mean, you know, even President Macron, let's face it, the French need no lessons on nationalism from us. But when President Macron speaks, there are two flags behind him. That would just be simply inconceivable in this country. I remember way back when, before most of you were born, I imagine, when I was doing my PhD, I had to spend some time in the library of the Assemblée Nationale in Paris. Every book in the library of the Assemblée Nationale in Paris has a sticker on it saying "Mon pays c'est l'Europe." Which is a stupid phrase, I think. But, you know, my country is Europe. Again, imagine the House of Commons library. So it's there. And it's there because for every other member state, European integration is an economic undertaking which has been carried out for political reasons. So for the six, it was pooling coal and steel to avoid war. For the southern European countries, it's about joining to turn your back on dictatorship. For the countries of Eastern Europe, it was rejoining Europe and getting out of the Soviet orbit and all those sorts of things. For us, it was an economic undertaking we undertook for economic reasons. And I think that partly explained why the glue that kept us in was weaker than it was for other member states. So that's why the EU is not going to fall apart as a result of this. Though I would say that, you know, it has changed the internal balance of the EU quite profoundly. The Swedes hate our guts for leaving them as the largest euro outs. Because when we were there, the euro outs had a voice, and actually it was one of the things that Cameron achieved in his renegotiation. But now the pressure on the euro outs to become euro ins is going to intensify quite significantly. Many of the smaller member states are upset that they've been left to the tender mercies of the French and the Germans. I remember doing a thing with a trade association a couple of years ago. I won't say which one, but they'd commissioned a report from people who count the votes in the European Parliament and on what the implications of Brexit would be. And they got the report basically had one point in its executive summary, which is you will never get regulation that is so close to your interests ever again now the British have left. So the nature of EU law is going to change as well. But why won't the EU forge ahead to unity? Well, because if you think about it, there are broadly speaking three big issues that sort of haunt, structural issues that haunt the EU. The first is the sort of values thing between East and West, which is here for a while, I think, and is going to become ever more bitter and ties into an answer I'll give to Macron, unless you want to cut me off because this answer is going on forever. The second is economic reform. They haven't solved the issues that were made apparent during the eurozone crisis, and they will come back in another crisis at some point. Nor have they solved the issue of migration, which is also going to come back. It might come back in the medium term as the population explosion happens in sub-Saharan Africa. It might happen far sooner because of instability in North Africa, which, as we know, is all too common. So they're the three big structural things, and they have two things in common. We weren't the problem, and we weren't the veto player stopping a solution. So in a sense, the big issues that divide the European Union are exactly the same as they were when we were a member state and no closer to a solution than they were when we were a member state. So I think, you know, I think the European Union will continue to muddle on. Macron, I think, again, who knows? The danger for Macron, of course, is not getting through the first round rather than losing the second round. I think he'll win. I think, you know, if you made me bet, I'd say that is the most likely outcome. His approval ratings for a sitting president this far into his term are eye-wateringly good. That being said, the regional elections were a calamity, and you've got to wonder about, when it comes to an election, whether the party machinery that doesn't really exist is up to the task. So it's not a slam dunk certainty, but I think Macron will win. I think Macron's impact on the European Union, I want to say that, I think he's quite damaging, actually, Macron. I think, you know, here's another one who likes his performative politics, who likes the big stage and to make his speeches, who likes to provoke the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. You know, I don't for a moment support what Viktor Orban is doing or what the Polish government is doing, but I think that debate has been made more bitter by the tone of people like Macron in the West, which has been often patronizing and morally superior in a way that you need to avoid in diplomatic exchange. So I think he exacerbates some of the problems within the European Union. Well, the Germans, I mean, it depends what the government is. Yes, they'll be slightly softer, perhaps, and more committed. So the line on China would have changed even if we'd had a CDU government, because I think the CDU is changing on China. That's the first thing. And I don't know if anyone even followed it. There's a very interesting fight going on over Confucius Institutes at German universities recently, because they have pulled presentations of a book written by a very, very prominent German journalist who was based in China for ages, who'd written a book about Xi Jinping and the Confucius Institutes. One of the Confucius Institute's arguments, which reminds me a bit of what the Indians said when they made that film Gandhi, was you can't portray Xi Jinping as just a normal human being like this. You can't write books like this about him, which was curious. But there's a big debate now about academic freedom in China starting in Germany. On the environmental issues, yes, Germany might become slightly more adventurous, but Germany isn't going to be the problem in the debates about environmental issues in the European Union. You've got the whole eastern side of the, and actually the southern side of the continent. If the economics of post-COVID is going to be very divisive, because some member states are going to recover a lot quicker than other member states, and that same old fight about distributive justice is going to. I'm boring myself now. I've been going for ages. Can we go on to the next? Sorry.
No, it's absolutely fine. We've got it's almost 12:30. Probably got enough time for one or two more questions. I don't know if there's anyone in the audience here who does have. If not, I will take this other question that Daniel Brown asks on the chat. How do you think Brexit will affect the overall opinion of Britain, both globally and nationwide? And could this affect trade deals with the rest of the world?
I think the first thing to remember about international politics, it tends to be utterly unemotional. So in that sense, whether there are people out there who think we're mad because we left the European Union, whether there are people out there who think it's great that we left the European Union, when they deal with us, they will seek to get what they can from their country, for their country, out of us. There is no doubt that some countries, here I would say the New Zealanders and the Australians foremost among them, see Brexit as a massive opportunity to screw us at the negotiating table over trade. And they've been quite open and honest about that. That works quite nicely for both sides, because they're so far away that actually, even if they do screw us over trade, the impact will be relatively small and contained, so it doesn't really matter. We'd had a trade negotiation. I mean, I've got to wonder about the government's keenness to have a trade deal with the United States, because I think it would be quite a messy negotiation, to be honest. So, yeah, I think countries will look at this and think, Britain needs new friends, so maybe we can leverage that. I'm sure Prime Minister Modi is thinking maybe this is the opportunity to get those visas they've kept refusing us because they're desperate. And that's not necessarily a zero-sum thing. You know, it will surprise no one who can see a camera that I'm relatively in favor of immigrants from India coming here. I mean, that's fine. But I don't think it's the case. I mean, sometimes you get this portrayed as, you know, oh God, there are people who are so upset about Brexit, they'll never want to deal with it. No, they'll want to do business with us, but they'll want to do business and get what they can get out of it for themselves. They're not going to do us favors. President Trump was never going to do us any favors. President Trump was going to do what it took for him to do what he wanted to do at home. He wasn't going to sort of say, okay, Boris, you can have a really good deal and we'll cut the agricultural bits just for you. Never going to happen. So I think, but it puts the onus on us to be, I mean, and you see it. You might not like it, but it puts the onus on us, I think, to be more outspoken, to be more present, to put more energy into foreign policy. And I think that's what the government has done, just to make that point that we're still here, we're still present, we want to be serious players. Now, we can argue about whether we have the capacity to actually do anything. Though I think, again, on Hong Kong, we acted impressively and quickly and ahead of the curve. On Magnitsky sanctions, we were the first to act. So actually, the record of this government when it comes to some aspects of foreign policy is pretty good, to be honest. But we'll see if they can maintain that. I wonder, I mean, so often I wonder about Boris Johnson, whether the attention will be the same when the cameras have gone. And if you think about this year, you know, we've chaired the G7, we chaired the Security Council for a while, and we're chairing COP26. So yeah, we're going to talk a lot about foreign policy because everyone's watching us. Whether we're talking so much about either the environment or foreign policy next year, we're not in the spotlight anymore. That will be the big test, I think.
Thank you very much. Well, it's time for others not to watch us any longer. We're at 4:30. So I'd just like to finish with 3 words of thanks. Firstly, thanks again to Kerry and Vanessa and Paul and Maddie for setting everything up logistically. Your efforts are much appreciated. Thank you very much. Secondly, big thanks to you all for coming, whether in person or online, and thanks for your terrific questions. And the biggest thanks, of course, goes to Anand for, as his characteristically engaging and insightful discussion. Such a pleasure to have you here. It reminds us why it's such a shame that you're no longer with us. But you are welcome back at any point. So whenever you'd like to come back and talk, we will extend a warm hand of welcome. So let's put our hands together. Appreciation for Anand. Thank you, everyone.